Well, we're doing a first here at Wheels Through Time. It's a new series that we're calling These Old Bikes, and it's truly the story of American history and rare American motorcycles like the one behind me or the one I'm sitting on. Here at Wheels Through Time, there's over 400 rare machines, and there's a story to tell on every one of these machines. Many of these stories have layers of history. We're going to get into some of those layers of history a little bit sooner on this bike and this bike both. But, you know, these old bikes here at Wheels Through Time are really relevant to American history. And I think the point of our programming is really share the relevance of Wheels Through Time with American history as we have gone through the last 120 years in American motorcycling. So the story I'm really talking about today was inspired recently with a clip that I saw online, and the clip was about a race in Daytona. It wasn't actually a race. It was trying to set a high-speed run in February of 1920. We're going to talk more about that in a minute, but what I want to tell you all about right now is the machine that I'm sitting on, because it kind of leads into the story of February of 1920. This particular machine is a Harley Davidson board track racer. It's in completely original condition. It's never been touched other than from what I've done in the last 30 years, been running it regularly at least once a week. But the bike has all the original finish. My good friend Bill at the Harley Davidson Museum in Milwaukee says this is his favorite bike at Wheels Through Time. I found the bike up in near Niagara Falls, Lockport, New York, probably about 25 years ago. And I've had a lot of fun with the bike. A really great story about the bike is in I think 1998 or 97, I brought it to Springfield, Illinois to the Springfield Mile, big motorcycle race, and that was where all the legends would show up. And my good friend Jim Davis was at Springfield in 1997, 1998. Jim died at 102, and Jim is really known still today as probably the premier American board track racing legend. I got to know Jim in the early 90s, and I spent as much time as I possibly could with Jim. At Springfield of that year, I've got plenty of pictures here and there of Jim sitting on this motorcycle, not just sitting, but running. And I think probably no better way to get this little show going than let me start the 1921 Harley Davidson SCA Harley board track racer. I didn't mention this. It is serial number 1. If you have a look at the motor number, it's 21 SCA 500, and that indicates serial number 1. As far as the rarity of the machine, priceless, only one known of its kind, and I'm going to start it up for you right now.
At Wheels Through Time, there are hundreds of motorcycles and dozens of cars, each with a story all of their own. From the rarest antiques to the most iconic styles, we are dedicated to telling the story of these old bikes.
Just like that. Now this is a single-cylinder version. It doesn't really roar like a twin-cylinder Harley Davidson board track racer like the bike Jim Davis rode would run, you know, well over 100 miles an hour. The history lesson we're talking about today actually takes us to 111 miles an hour. So in the early 90s, when I met Jim, he was able to share with me a lot of his stories on board track racing. Told me a great story about flying an airplane into Murrock Dry Lake and the thing crashed. And he always had a great story, and it was always a new story. After Jim's board track racing career, he went on to work for the AMA as a flagman at all the AMA dirt track races. If you ever look at an old AMA magazine, you see the guy holding that flag. That was Jim Davis, and quite a legend he was. What made Jim particularly famous was this motorcycle right here, one of the many bikes that made him famous. And I'll tell you a little bit about this, and then I'm going to tell you about the bike behind it. And that's going to really lead to the history lesson that we're talking about today. But in 1920, Jim set a new record at Dodge City on this motorcycle. And if you'll notice, this engine is quite a bit different, this engine. And he also signed it for me right here. It says, "To Dale from Jim Davis on 3/6/1997, just 101 years old." He wrote his birth date of 3/23/1896. And I said to Jim, "Jim, what was your favorite motor?" And really, in the terminology of that day, what motor meant is, what was your favorite motorcycle? And right off the bat, he wrote this down, CA9. And CA9 is the serial number of a very special engine. That engine, it's called a banjo engine. That number also comes up in reference in several books that Jim quoted that number, so I truly believe it is the number. And of course, that was Dodge City 1920, where he, July 4th, where he won the race. Well, behind the Dodge City bike is this bike. And let me tell you what this is. This is the same engine, not the exact same engine. This is CA4. This is what's called a Harley Davidson Banjo 2-cam engine. This engine came out for the first run in February of 1920. There's less than 8 of these engines known. It's actually one of the most priceless Harley Davidson relics on the planet. And I found this engine in Montana back in the mid-'80s. I've got a great picture right here you're welcome to look at later of the day I found that engine in Montana. And I brought the engine back. I had it for about 30 years and a very similar time frame. It's actually kind of interesting because when I was hanging around with Jim Davis, maybe some of his energy rubbed off on me, but you know, to be able to find this motorcycle, also plenty of pictures of Jim sitting on this bike, but also to find this engine was such a priceless thing to find right in that same time frame when I was friends with Jim. The frame, I just found the frame. Everybody said, "What are you going to do with that Harley Banjo engine, Dale?" And I said, "Someday I'll get lucky and found a frame." And this past spring, I found this chassis. But we're really not to the history lesson yet. I just wanted to kind of bring you into the frame of the time period and what was going on. Board track racing was kind of at a peak. Shortly after that, there was a 2-year hiatus, Harley Davidson from board track racing, 1921, 1922. But the lesson today goes back to February of 1920, and that's what these pictures are all about, right here, these 3 pictures. And that's what the clip is all about. So the clip was the story of Red Parkhurst and Fred Ludlow taking, in 1920, the Banjo engine, this engine right here. You can see it in the picture here. You can see it in the picture here. And it was the first time that engine had ever been debuted in any way, in any form. And they did it at the Festival of Speed in Daytona in 1920. Obviously, ice cold in Milwaukee. There wasn't anybody going down the streets in Milwaukee. So they took the bike to Daytona with the purpose of setting 2 records, a solo record and a sidecar record. And of course, the sidecar record, there had to be somebody in the sidecar. It was also the introduction of the new ultralight bullet sidecar. So the Harley Davidson racing team, which was Fred Ludlow, the racing manager, I forget his name, and Red Parkhurst went to Florida and they set up the track. The track was 5 miles long. And it was electronically timed with the most sophisticated timing equipment. I forgot the name of the equipment, but the way it worked, it was a 5-mile stretch down the beach, and they actually strung a wire for 5 miles, and which is unheard of in the digital age that we're in today. But they strung a wire for 5 miles, and at all the intervals where they wanted to check the record speed across the track, they actually had a wire that was 2 inches above the sand, and the bike would run over that and trip the wire so the machine would know when each wire was tripped, therefore able to understand how these records were set. So they set numerous records on the beach, and it is so well documented. Motor Age magazine had a tremendous story about it. The AMA magazine, American Motorcyclist at the time, had a tremendous story. But what's really most interesting is, as I mentioned, what had inspired this conversation today was the video clip. And the video clip is probably some of the best high-quality film footage I've ever seen from 1920 that absolutely documents what Parkhurst and Ludlow did on the beach. The speed itself is actually kind of interesting because at this time, this is the 1,000 cc's, but they set their record on an engine that was slightly bigger. it's not really called cheating, but it's called like bending the rules a little bit, okay? So they wanted to have this, big feast of speed, and so they did it kind of with a cheater motor, although they acknowledged that. But they also ran the 61-inch motors, and they ran also well over 100 miles an hour. So the lesson, of course, Harley Davidson always at the forefront of racing. In 1920, their ability to take a racing team to Florida with brand new equipment, untested, find the best people available to test their speeds. They had all kinds of referees, etc., marking that speed. But what I'm really here to tell you is about the artifact that I found about 15 years ago. And this is the trophy that Red Parkhurst won. Red Parkhurst, February 6, 1920, Daytona, Florida. The AAT&A SIDECAR 1, 2, and 5 mile trophy. So the trophy from the race, don't have the bike, have an engine very similar to it. And really the last thing that I wanted to share with you, pictures available after the conversation, you're welcome to look at them. But in 1997, when I had Jim sitting on this bike running, I took the trophy to Jim because Red Parkhurst was his best friend. And the idea was to get Jim Davis's recollection of Red Parkhurst setting that record on an engine very similar to his favorite engine. Now the problem was that was 20 years ago. I have lost the recollection of his recollection, but I do have the recollection of spending time with Jim, and I have the photos to prove it, and that's the history lesson we got today. That's all, folks.